Good evening, everybody. This is Mark Malloy with Emerging Revolutionary War. We are getting close now to the big 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War, and we're really honored tonight to have a guest join us from one of the most iconic places associated with the beginning of the Revolutionary War. You can see it behind me here. Old North Church in Boston, Massachusetts. And we're pleased to have Emily Spence from Old North Church. So thank you, Emily, for coming on to talk to us about the history and the site and what you all have planned. But first, yeah, if you want to introduce yourself to our group, we'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark, for having me on. As you said, my name is Emily Spence. I'm the Director of Education at Old North Illuminated. So we are the nonprofit that does the preservation, interpretation, and education at Old North Church and Historic Site. So I'm really pleased to be with you today and excited to share a little bit more about our story.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, no, it's anybody who hasn't been up there, it is one of the most imposing sites, I think, in the north section of Boston and pretty iconic and yeah, so if you could start us off, I guess, by giving us a little background on the church itself, I guess, people who might not be familiar with this church and some of the stories of its beginnings and what it meant to people in Boston during the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to share my screen because I have some pictures to share as well. So the Old North Church is Boston's oldest church building. It was built in 1723, and it was only the second Anglican or Church of England church in Boston. Boston was founded by Puritans. It was by the 1700s, still a primarily Puritan or Congregationalist city. So the community not really thrilled about Old North coming in. The Puritans were trying to get away from the Church of England. But the members of Old North built it nonetheless. Most of them probably came from King's Chapel, those original members. King's Chapel was the first Anglican church in Boston, and the congregation was starting to become too large for the church building. And so they members of it decided to build another Anglican church in Boston's North End. And the first rector of Old North was the Reverend Dr. Timothy Cutler, whose picture I have here on the left. And I wanted to just mention him too because he was quite a get for Old North Church. He was actually a Congregationalist minister. He was the rector at Yale University. And in September of 1722, during Yale commencement, he gave a speech in which he quoted the Book of Common Prayer, which was part of the Church of England. And he said this line, and let the people say Amen. And it was kind of this mic drop moment because he had revealed that he had had this conversion. And so the next day, he resigned from Yale, and a number of other ministers followed him. And the people who were establishing Old North heard about this, and so they reached out to him and asked him if he would be the rector for Old North, and he agreed. And so he went over to England and was ordained an Anglican minister, and then came back and served as the rector at Old North. And he is to this day the longest serving rector of Old North. He was there for over 40 years.
Hmm. Wow.
Um, yeah, so I also included here a picture of the interior of Old North. This is a picture of it today, but it looks very similar to how it would have looked in the 1700s. And the things that people always notice when they come into Old North are the box pews. So I wanted to mention that as well, because that was kind of an important part of the early congregation here. The box pews are just what they sound like. They're pews that are shaped like boxes. And they were kind of the fashion at the time. We believe that Old North's design was based on designs done by the architect Christopher Wren, who was very popular in England at the time. And box pews served a practical purpose. People who worshiped at Old North had to buy a seat. And then once they bought it, it was their property in the church. So people would decorate their pews, they could sell them to someone else, they could will them to a family member. They were also owning a box pew made one a voting member of the church. And so we have examples of, times where the husband would die and he would pass on the box pew to his wife. And so now she not only owned property in the church, but she too became a voting member of Old North, at a time when women weren't able to vote in this country. But the other thing that I'll point out about the box pews is that they were very, very expensive. Um, it was, I've seen them in the record for up to 30 to 50 pounds. Um, 30 pounds was about how much the average day laborer made in a year. So very, very expensive. This was a very wealthy and elite congregation that was worshiping here. A lot of them worked in the maritime trades, so as sea captains or merchants, or rope makers and sail makers. And so we suspect that people were coming to Old North not just as a way to practice their faith, but also as a way to make business connections and maybe do a little bit of networking. But that then I think begs the question, if you couldn't afford a box pew, what would you do? And that's where this balcony seating comes in, what we call the gallery. People who couldn't afford a box pew had to sit in the gallery. The South Gallery, which is in this photo, the section of the balcony that's on the right side, we believe probably would have been a lot of servants and indentured servants, poor families, and children under the age of 12 typically sat in the gallery. And then on the left side, the North Gallery is where Black and Indigenous members of the church sat. It was a segregated seating at Old North. So we see the divisions that existed within Boston society being reinforced here by the seating at Old North. And there was a very large community of Black and Indigenous members of the church, both in free and enslaved. And that a lot of that went back to Cutler. Cutler saw this church as a mission. It was actually established as a mission church by a group called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, a really nice, snappy name there. And so he saw it as his job to bring people into the church, including Black and Indigenous people. But we know from Cutler's sermons that this didn't mean that he necessarily saw them as equals in the church. He talks about how people should bring their enslaved people to be baptized because in his eyes, that would make them more amenable to their subservient status. And so we know that Cutler too himself was an enslaver.
Now these the boxes and everything you see, how much of this stuff is original, I guess, and how much of it's been reconstructed later?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the box pews, the church took out the box pews in the early 1800s. They are limiting in numbers. You can't fit a lot of people in the church with the boxes. And so they put in slip pews, which allowed for there to be more people. The congregation was growing. People still had to own those pews, the slip pews, but there were more of them. And then in 1912, the church did a big restoration. It had kind of started to fall into disrepair. And they were, by that point, really kind of recognizing that it wasn't just a church, but it was also a historic site. It was a place that people, visitors, tourists wanted to see. And so they restored it back to its colonial appearance. And a lot of the original wood for the box pews was still downstairs in the basement. And when they tore up the slip pews, they saw markings on the ground that showed where the box pews went. So though these are restored, they're restored. A lot of them are using the original wood and they are in the original, I guess, formation that they would have been in.
Oh wow, yeah, no, that's pretty neat. You're still able to, yeah, salvage some of that. Now,
Mhm.
during the 1700s, did they refer to it as the Old North Church, or was it where did that kind of designation come into play?
That's a great point. That when it was opened, and actually to this day, its formal name is actually Christ Church in the city of Boston, and it would have been known as Christ Church. At the time of the Revolution, there was another church in the North End called Old North Meeting House, and so that would have been known, would have, I guess, had the nickname of Old North. Um, and I'm not sure at what point we're unclear as to what point the nickname then shifted over to to Old North Church to Christ Church in the city of Boston. But we know by the time Longfellow wrote his poem in 1860, he was referring to it as the North Church or the Old North Church. So we think probably by then.
Okay. Huh. Now, yeah, and so the big event you mentioned the poem. The big event that's always associated with the Old North Church is the hanging of the lanterns in the in the steeple. Can you tell us, yeah, what actually happened on April 18th, 1775?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and I'm going to set the scene for us. So we're going to jump ahead to the year 1775. And I'm sure probably many of your listeners are sort of familiar with what's happening in Boston at this time. It is a very tense, anxious, divided city. People are arguing over the issue of taxation. And Old North was also a very divided community. We talk about it as being a community united in their faith, but divided in their politics. And that wasn't necessarily the same for other churches in Boston, but that was the case at Old North. Being a Church of England church, it would have had sort of that connection to England, but also it was, as I mentioned, a lot of its members were involved in the maritime trades. So the closure of the port of Boston after the Tea Party would have had a negative impact on a lot of these members' businesses. And so, we have a mix, and I almost wonder if there were some people who maybe were leaning more loyalist, and then as time went on, started to lean more to the Patriot side. As I like to say, everyone was a loyalist until they weren't in Boston. And I have here a couple of pictures of some of the loyalist members of the church. The rector at the time, the Reverend Mather Byles Jr., was a loyalist. His father was also a notorious loyalist in Boston, and he was, giving loyalist sermons from the pulpit to a very divided congregation. We also had Captain John Pulling Jr., who was a member of the Sons of Liberty and friends with Revere and Warren. And he was sitting just a few pews up from General Thomas Gage, who was here in Boston, leading as the kind of the commander of the British troops that were here. So it was a very divided congregation. And of course, I mentioned that there was also the Black and Indigenous community here too, that there were enslaved people who I'm sure for them, their voices, their opinions on these events have not been recorded for our church, but I'm sure for many of them, the irony of their enslavers talking about being slaves unto the king was not lost on them either. So it was a very tense church community as well. And actually, on the afternoon of April 18th, Reverend Mather Byles resigns or is fired or is strongly encouraged by the vestry to resign. It's a little bit ambiguous. We know that he was upset because his salary wasn't being paid. He believed that it was because people differed from him politically, but we also know that the members of the church were suffering financially because of the closure of the Port of Boston, and were claiming they weren't able to pay his salary because of that. So it's a little bit unclear. But on that very afternoon, he resigns from his position as the rector. Now, what's been going on in Boston in April of 1775, things are heating up. There's a lot of tension with the British soldiers who are here. It is an occupied city. We believe about 1 in 5 people in Boston at the time would have been a British soldier. So it's a very large military presence here. And things were heating up to the point where the Sons of Liberty were recognizing that it may come to fighting. And so in preparation, they had collected stores of gunpowder and ammunition. And I know J.L. Bell talks about this a lot, some cannons too that they stole. And they hid that in the town of Concord. Well, Gage and his soldiers knew about this, and they were not really thrilled at the idea. So Gage was planning to order his soldiers to go out to Concord and seize it. And the Sons of Liberty knew that Gage knew this, but if they wanted to stop him, they needed to know 2 really important things. They needed to know when he was planning to do this, and they needed to know what route he was going to take. And I know this sounds like a small detail, but it was important because of the geography of Boston at the time. And I have a map here. So if this is Boston, this little peninsula here in Boston Harbor, in order to leave Boston, in order for these British soldiers to leave Boston, they really only had two options. They either had to march south down the Boston Neck and then back north up to where Concord is, or they could row across the Charles River and then march north. So that route going by the river is 2 to 3 hours faster for them, but the logistics of getting your army in rowboats at night secretively is a little bit more complicated. So it could have gone either way, but because of that time difference, it was really important that the Sons of Liberty knew. So it is Revere, Paul Revere, who lived in the North End, just a few blocks away from Old North, who comes up with a plan. He says, we just need a very simple signal. We'll use lanterns. And to make sure our signal lanterns are seen, we will put them in the tallest point in Boston, which in 1775 was the top of Old North Steeple. That's why Old North was chosen for this plan. And as he said, the signal would be simple. One lantern would show that the soldiers were leaving by the land route, by the Boston Neck, and two lanterns would be a signal that they were leaving by the water route. And so that's what they do. On April 18th, 1775, Sons of Liberty find out from spies that the soldiers are taking the water route. They've been spotted with rowboats. So Paul Revere asks two friends to enact this plan with the signal lanterns. He asks the sexton of the church, Robert Newman, and a member of the vestry, Captain John Pulling Jr., who I had mentioned earlier, who was also a member of the Sons of Liberty. And so what they do is they enter the church at night, they climb up to the top of the steeple, and they hold up two lanterns for 1 minute. And they only do 1 minute because Revere has already organized this network of riders to wait across the river in Charlestown. So once those riders, we believe that there were around 30 or more of them, then once they see those lights go up in the steeple, they too get on horses and start to ride around Massachusetts to warn the local people. So it wasn't just Revere and Dawes riding that night, but all of these other associates of Revere that he had organized. And it was successful. The next morning, when the British soldiers arrive in Concord, they are outnumbered by all of the American militiamen who have gathered there in Concord. And so we now remember those events as the battles of Lexington and Concord and the beginnings of the American Revolutionary War. But I would be remiss if I did not return back to the story of Newman and Pulling. Revere, of course, gets all the credit with the poem, but Newman and Pulling also, we like to talk about, were heroes from that night too. They were not supposed to be out at night. There was a curfew in Boston, so they were breaking curfew to essentially commit treason. And they were almost caught. They held up the lanterns for only 1 minute. They're trying to keep it brief to not draw attention to themselves. But soldiers did see those lights. It's not surprising, thinking that it's the tallest point in Boston. There's no other, skyscrapers or electricity to compete with it. So soldiers see it. And by the time Newman and Pulling climb all the way back down, the soldiers are at the front doors of the church knocking, wondering who's inside. And there was no back door at that time. So according to Newman's descendants, they escaped by jumping out one of the back windows. From there, Pulling and his family left Boston. They went to stay with his wife's family in either Hingham or Hull. I've heard both mentioned. And he's gone from Boston for years. He's not able to make it back. And Newman actually was arrested, but because Pulling wasn't there, he was able to say that he gave the key to Pulling, and so both of them were able to escape.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah, that's crazy. Now, and so Revere, he wasn't in the, was he in the church that night, or did he leave to go row across the river there?
Yeah, so he did not enter the church that night. That's a common misconception that he was involved in hanging the lanterns. But he, had his own important mission to get out to Lexington to warn Hancock and Adams who were out there. And so he asks, he says, and he actually never tells us who it was. And actually, neither Newman or Pulling ever admit to it during their lives as well. All he tells us in a letter to Jeremy Belknap is that he asked a friend. And Newman and Pulling's descendants, after they both had passed, came out and said it was them. So he either asked both of them or one of them, and then went off on his ride.
Hmm. Wow, yeah, no, that's something I find studying a lot of the Sons of Liberty things around Boston because of the secretive nature
Mhm.
thing. It is difficult to parse out what exactly happened because yeah, they were trying to keep it hidden for so long. So
Yeah, that's exactly it. We suspect that they probably swore oaths that they would never admit to it. They were, all involved in the Masons too, so that may have had an aspect as well that they really couldn't have took that seriously.
and that rider network you mentioned was phenomenal for the Patriot militias because yeah, in the ensuing battles, you have militias coming from all over New England
Mhm.
that day to partake in the battle, and it's just amazing how they had this whole network planned out.
Yeah.
Imagine how much effort and work went into having that kind of network is pretty amazing. So
Yeah, one of the things that I just find remarkable about the plan is there were so many elements of it that, if one part went wrong, then there was like another part to sort of back it up. They kind of had, planned for everything.
mm-hmm. Now, as far as actually hanging the lanterns, I've heard it might have been physically how difficult was that as an actual enterprise, as far as like getting up to the top of the steeple.
Yeah, so that's another reason why we believe that it was both Newman and Pulling, because the climb up to the steeple is not easy. It's about 8 stories up. The stairs, the first few staircases up there. I mean, they first had to climb into the gallery and then squeeze behind the organ through a crawl space to get into the tower. And then there's some narrow staircases that bring you up past the bells. There's like split risers too, which are a little bit challenging to navigate. You have to push your way through a trap door. And then from there, it's 4 more stories of ladders and another heavy trap door that you have to push your way through. So even, I've done it a few times and, I'm with both hands, it's very challenging. So to have both your hands, holding lanterns probably when it wouldn't have been possible. So that's why we think there was probably two of them. The other thing is that people have asked how far did they have to be standing apart from one another in order for them to be seen as two distinct lights. And so we actually had a few years ago some curious students from MIT test it out for us. And they concluded that you would need two people to be up there to be standing far apart enough that it could be distinguishable as one light versus two lights. You can kind of almost see it in the picture behind you. There are two lights up there, but they're right next to each other, so they look like just one.
Yeah, that's a great, yeah, actual question about yeah how physically it actually happened. And I think it's amazing too that they yeah just had it up for 1 minute. You imagine the riders over in Charlestown. I mean, if they yeah took a break from looking at the skyline for a minute, then they would miss it. So it's
Yeah.
you just think about them the watch, I guess, keeping an eye out for an extended period of time. So.
Yeah.
Um, wow. And then so that happens in the church, and then I guess what happens after the fact? Is there any sort of you mentioned one of them was arrested? Was there any sort of punishment? And then and basically what goes on with this church in the aftermath of the opening of the actual conflict?
Yeah, so Newman was arrested, and I should also mention that Newman's house was being used to quarter British soldiers. So he I like to think was doubly brave that he snuck out to do this with British soldiers literally underneath his roof. But he was arrested. He was able to say, I don't have the key to the church, because as sexton he would, but he said, I don't have the key to the church. I gave it to Pulling. Pulling's nowhere to be found. And so they let him go. But as I mentioned earlier, literally that day, that afternoon, Reverend Mather Byles resigned. And then the next day, war breaks out. And then there's the siege of Boston. So this they're not able to get another minister. And so actually the church is shuttered for 2.5 years. And that is the only time during the church's 302 history that it has not been used. They're not able to access, go to services there or anything like that. And, now having lived through the COVID pandemic, I think about that a lot. I think that's something we can relate to at a time of of anxiety and stress, not having access to a community that's really important to you. I think we can all relate to how devastating that would be. It is finally reopened. I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but they do reopen. As I mentioned, about 2.5 years later, there is a British chaplain who was captured during the war, named Reverend Stephen Lewis. And during his time as a POW, he has a conversion. He swears an oath of allegiance to America, to the United States, and then is sent to Boston to reopen Old North as actually it is now an Episcopal church. The Church of England, ministers of the Church of England have to swear an oath of allegiance to the British monarch. They also, they're part of prayers and, moments in the church where they talk about God save the king. So as you can imagine, that would be problematic for this new United States. And so many of these Church of England churches become Episcopal churches instead. But just a few months after the battles of Lexington and Concord, as I'm sure probably many of you know, there was a battle that happened much closer to Old North, just across the river in Charlestown, the Battle of Bunker Hill. And during that battle, Major John Pitcairn, who was a British Marine, he was the one kind of on the ground commanding the British forces. He was wounded at that battle, fatally wounded. And the story is that his son, who was also there, took him off the battlefield, put him in a rowboat, and kissed him goodbye and sent him across the river to the North End. And it was in the North End that Major Pitcairn was treated for his wounds, or they tried to treat them. There is a story, there's a legend that Old North was used as a field hospital by the British during that battle. We don't have any evidence confirming it, but we also don't have any evidence denying it either. So it may be true. There's a few different stories about where Major Pitcairn was, treated after that battle. But he does die of those wounds in the North End. And Old North being close by, he is buried there. It is a Church of England church, and that would be the church that he belonged to. So he's buried in the crypt, maybe. So a few years after he was buried at Old North in the crypt beneath the church, his family back in England requested that his body be sent back to them. And so Old North obliged and sent a body. And then he arrived, the family took a look at it. Enough time had passed that he was not recognizable, but they did notice that he was wearing a lieutenant's jacket, not a major's jacket. So there was some question as to whether Old North had sent back the right body or not. And it is a question to this day if Major Pitcairn is in Old North crypt or back in England. I mentioned him earlier, but the historian J.L. Bell did a series of blog posts really digging into this. And I found his conclusions pretty convincing. So if anyone wants to kind of follow up and see what J.L. Bell thinks, I highly recommend them.
Yeah, he's great. We've had him on our show a few times. And yeah, his Boston 1775 blog. Yeah, he certainly does his research on leaves no stone unturned. So
Yeah.
yeah, no, that's fascinating. Yeah, so I guess they buried the body they received over there in England.
They
So
did. Yes. Yeah.
yeah, I'm gonna have to look into that. That's
Yeah.
well, and can you tell us a little bit about the crypt itself? So is that was a burial spot? Was there a burying ground around the church as well, or?
Yes, yeah. So the church is also very close to Copp's Hill burying ground, but burying grounds were typically used by Puritans. Puritans believed that when you died, you were done with your body. So there wasn't a need for there to be a funeral or for a minister to oversee the burial, offer prayers, or anything like that. So they didn't believe in burying in unconsecrated or holy ground. So they buried in burying grounds, which were city owned. So like Cops Hill Burying Ground, Granary, those are all city owned pieces of property. For the people at Old North, that was not their belief. They did believe that it was important to have a funeral, to have the minister present, to say those prayers, and to bury on consecrated ground. So a burying ground like Cops Hill wasn't as appealing an option for them. Um, and they didn't have the space around their church to build or to make their own churchyard. As I mentioned earlier, they were not really a welcome presence in Boston. So the city sold them just enough land for the church. They didn't have necessarily more land to create then a space to bury. So instead, they buried underneath their church. They built a crypt. So they started to build that in 1732. They started with one tomb, and then they gradually added on for a total of 37 tombs. By the mid 19th century, they had uh, built all of the tombs. And we believe that they were burying in there. They told us that they officially stopped in 1860, though we have found evidence that they continued into at least the 1870s. Um, but we know that, or we believe that there are about 1,100 people who are buried in the crypt. And they are still there. Sometimes people ask if the bodies are still there, and they are. Um, people who visit the church are still able to go down and to see the crypt and to learn a little bit more about how those burials work. So if that interests anyone, I highly encourage you to come by. It's definitely one of our most uh, popular parts of the church.
Yeah, and some of us also noticed that that you all have done some archaeology with regard to the crypt. Can you tell us a little bit about what they've done down there archaeologically?
Yeah, so a couple years ago in 2023, we did a restoration of the crypt. And so actually this photo that I have here of Major John Pitcairn's tomb is pre-restoration. It looks a little bit different now. We added in a ramp. Our goal is to eventually make the crypt entirely ADA accessible. So part of that project was putting in a ramp. They also did some repointing of the bricks, which just means that they were repairing the mortar in between bricks where that had broken down. And they also restored some of the doors. So that's probably one of the biggest differences with Major John Pitcairn's tomb is underneath this plaster here is a wooden door. And there were not every tomb were we able to do this. Some of them didn't have the plaster on it. They've been sealed with brick or with stone, but about 10 to 15 of the tombs were sealed up with this plaster. And so what we were able to do was remove the plaster, which revealed the doors, and then have those doors taken off site to be restored. So during that time, we were able to see inside the tombs. And as you mentioned, we were working with city archaeologists on this project. So they were present for much of this, making sure that everything was handled properly. They were the ones doing the majority of the kind of the study. No one went into any of the tombs. They have technology that they can use that allows them to scan the tombs without going inside of them. Since it was a burial place in an active church, that was something that was really important to us, was that these are graves that we don't want to disturb. But we were able to learn a lot from this. And I know for me, I kind of look at it as there were things about the crypt that we believed that this project allowed us to either confirm or debunk. So we talked a lot about how when people were buried, their coffins were stuffed with cedar shavings, since they weren't really doing anything at this time to preserve bodies. And so the cedar shavings were kind of to help combat some of that. And when we opened up the tombs, overwhelmingly what we could see inside of these tombs were the remnants of those cedar shavings.
Yeah.
We also, though, you know, the coffins, we have one coffin lid that we have on display. It's a very small, simple coffin, but when we saw inside the tombs, we also saw that there were very large coffins. Some of them were very ornate. So it kind of confirmed for us or showed us that, people then, we like to say people then were smaller then, but they were also large then too, that came in all shapes and sizes, just like we do today. And the coffins also varied as well. Um, and then the other big thing that we learned that I find the most interesting is what I mentioned earlier. The church record tells us that they stopped burying in 1860. They were actually supposed to stop in 1853. The city passed an ordinance banning crypt burials in 1853 because of the smell that was coming from them. The church was very upfront about how they were going to ignore that, and so they continued until 1860, is what the record says. But we found nameplates, which would have been on the tops of the coffins. One of those named plates put the death date at 1872. So we know that on the sly they were putting in a few more people into the crypt.
Huh.
Yeah.
Now, you have the picture of the Pitcairn tomb. Is there anybody in there, or was that where they took the body out of to send to England?
Yes, so the tombs kind of vary in how full they are. Some of them, if they were family owned, perhaps they're a little bit more empty. It's just kind of the members of the family. But if they were church owned, they seem to be much more full. And so Pitcairn's tomb is one that is very, very full. We were kind of hoping when we opened that one that we'd be able to finally confirm if he was in there or not, but we weren't able to tell.
Just because there's multiple people in there?
Yes, yeah. And the coffins, when they were put inside the tombs, they're stacked on top of one another. So some of these tombs, there's as many as 20 to 24 coffins inside of there. Over time, though, those stacks have broken down, so they're not necessarily neatly stacked anymore. So it's kind of hard to tell, kind of what goes with what.
Interesting. Huh. Wow. Yeah, so very interesting. But now you mentioned church burials in a what happened after the war? You said it was shuttered during the war. How do they reopen at the end of all of this? And yeah, what kind of happens in the 19th century with this church?
Yeah, so they're not able to reopen until they're able to get a minister, and that is Reverend Stephen Lewis. And so he is able to help them reopen the church. They reopen as a Episcopal church, and they kind of continue on. And what I always kind of find fascinating is they really did not see themselves as famous. I don't think even Newman or Pulling really ever became famous during their lifetimes. They swore themselves to secrecy. Nobody knew that they were involved. And it really wasn't until Longfellow's poem that the church starts to become part of this story. And I have got pictures here of Longfellow. So Longfellow, by 1860, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is a well-known poet. He's living in Cambridge. And so he comes to visit Old North because at that point, he is concerned about the tension and division and anxiety in his country, this time not over taxation, but over slavery. 1860, the country is on the brink of civil war. And so that is his impetus to come to Old North. And he's looking for a story that he could tell that would inspire people to feel like they, as an individual, could take action and make a difference in this looming war. And so he comes across the story of Revere and the signal lanterns, and that inspires him to write his now very famous poem, Paul Revere's Ride, which was first published in a collection of poems, Tales of a Wayside Inn. And in that poem, the Old North Church and the signal lanterns play a prominent role. And that kind of helps to enshrine Old North in part of the story of Revere's Ride and really kind of within this mythology around, America's founding and the Revolution, and has kind of helped it to become this icon of America's story and this icon of freedom. So it really was kind of then the Longfellow effect is what I call it. And if it's okay, I'm going to share kind of an example of how that kind of played out in Old North's history. So Old North has actually had three steeples. We're on steeple number 3 right now. The first steeple was built in 1740. It was taken up, it was paid for by subscription. largest donation came from a group of merchants called the Gentlemen of the Bay of Honduras, and they dealt in logwood. Logwood was very valuable for making a stable dye. Logwood was also completely reliant on, its production was completely reliant on enslaved labor, which is kind of an irony, or what we describe as a paradox of the Old Norse steeple, that it went on to be kind of this symbol of freedom, but it has those ties to labor people who were enslaved. But that steeple blew off the church in 1804. There was the 1804 Great Gale of Boston that took the steeple off. So the people at Old North had to rebuild the steeple. They took up another subscription. So it was the congregation again that paid for it, and they had it rebuilt. They did not build it to look like the first steeple. And I point that out because what that tells me is that it was their steeple. They didn't see it yet as something that people would want to come see. So they built it. It looked different. They added in this clock here, which was not in the first steeple. The steeple also blows off the church in Hurricane Carol in 1954. If you come to Old North, I strongly encourage you to take a bell tower tour because we have some really great photos of the steeple in that storm and the aftermath that are pretty remarkable to see. But again, Old North has to rebuild their steeple. But by this point, Longfellow has written the poem. And so it has now become part of the story. It's now kind of a tourist attraction. People from all over have been coming to see the steeple. We're also by the 1950s in the midst of the Cold War. And so I think there is a lot of thought and concern about, America's history and the story of democracy. And so the steeple has become this important symbol by then. So this time subscription is taken up from around the country. People from all over donate money to rebuild the steeple. So this time they follow the original plans. So the steeple today looks just as it would have looked in 1775, but this time we've added some steel beams on the inside. So it's now attached to the top of the church. And hopefully some of these windy days that we have had, the steeple will hold up to those.
Wow. Yeah, no, I heard, yeah, they had been rebuilt, but that's interesting that, you can, yeah, just through those different images, you can see how it's changed. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, the impact of Longfellow on, yeah, remembering that whole story. Um, well, that's yeah, fascinating. So yeah, well now we're so today, like you said, so the church is still a active church, and it's also a site. Can you tell us a little bit about how you all basically operate the site today?
Yeah, so it's still an active church. It's still an Episcopal church. It's now an open congregation, which means that you don't need to own a pew to attend. So anyone who is interested is welcome to attend services at Old North. And we are also a historic site. So um, when services are not happening at the church, we're open for people to visit. So we have options for people to come and explore the sanctuary of the church. We have an exhibit that we opened just a couple of years ago and audio guides, as well as a kids scavenger hunt, which is what's happening over here in this picture. We also offer tours of the bell ringing chamber where you can go and see where Paul Revere rang the bells. He was not a member of the church, he was a Congregationalist, but he was among the first bell ringers. So you can see where he hung out when he was 15 years old. And as I mentioned, you can still go and visit the crypt too. We do both tours and self-guided of the crypt. As I also talked about, we do preservation projects. So we did a restoration of the crypt, and then we're currently doing a restoration of some of the original 18th century paint. In 1912, during the restoration I mentioned earlier, the interior of the church was whitewashed, including these original cherubs from 1727. So we have conservators in the church right now uncovering those. And this is the first time we're seeing them in over 100 years. So this is a very exciting project. And then the last 2 summers, we had a play at the church, an original play called Revolution's Edge, which imagined a conversation between Mather Byles, John Pulling Jr., and Mather Byles's enslaved man Cato on the afternoon of April 18th, talking about the coming revolution. And if I'm not jumping ahead too much, I brought that up because the play is coming back for one night only. April 18th. We're commemorating the 250th anniversary of the lantern signals with a costume table read of Revolution's Edge out on the Paul Revere Mall. It is free, open to anyone to come see. At the end of that, the lanterns will go on in the church, and Paul Revere himself will walk by, and you can follow him and watch him go down to the harbor and row across to Charlestown and begin his ride. So that's happening on April 18th. And then I guess now since I'm talking about it, I'll get into this as well. But we're also marking the 250th on April 16th. We're holding our annual Lanterns and Luminaries event. That will be honoring Ken Burns. It's currently sold out, but there may be more tickets that are going to become available. So if you're interested, I highly encourage you to get on the wait list for that. I hope I didn't jump ahead too much, but I got excited.
So some of us with Emerging Revolutionary War will be up there for some of these events. Yeah, people are interested in coming to any stuff. Where can they get more information about this?
Yeah, so if you go on our website, we have a couple of pages dedicated under historic site. I'm sorry, under events. We have a couple of pages dedicated to the April 18th, or sorry, the April events.
Okay, great. Yeah, no. And yeah, like I said, some of us will be up there to watch and follow along in real time a lot of Revere's ride, but I think it's you all are going to be marking the event in real time. It should be pretty cool to be on the site. And yeah, anybody who hasn't been up there, yeah, I think it's such a imposing view yet to this day to see seeing the steeple and then going down to actually inside the church is pretty awesome. Very cool.
I'm very excited about it. I'm looking forward to it. And we don't light up the steeple that often. And it's, as you can see from the picture behind you, it's just remarkable. So I think that alone is worth coming down to see.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Emily, for joining us. We really appreciated it. And yeah, thanks. And we'll be in touch. We'll be coming back in a couple weeks. Like I said, you can follow along with Emerging Revolutionary War. We're going to be trying to bring you stuff from the 250th anniversary of Boston and Lexington and Concord. So it should be a good time. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.